Welcome to The Economist Next Door, a podcast where we make complex economic ideas accessible. No PhD required.
He who pays the piper calls the tune. In that when the federal government is transferring money to the states, when they're transferring money to local governments, or even just the states sending money to local governments, that funding often comes with terms and conditions baked in, and those terms and conditions often dictate a lot of policy that would never fly in Congress, would never hold up in courts, and quite often the excuses that comes from federal policymakers is that, well, you guys never had to take the money, you voluntarily took it, and by doing that, you're accepting often really stringent terms and conditions.
If you asked a neighbor which matters more, their state government or the federal government, 9 times out of 10, I think they'd point to D.C. That's not surprising. Over 30% of state budgets now come directly from the federal government, and that money always comes with strings attached. But it wasn't always this way. For much of our history, states were the primary seat of governance, and the federal role was strictly limited. So how did the scales tip so far in its favor? In today's episode, I'm joined by my AIER colleagues, Dave Hebert and Tom Savidge, to trace the history of how federal policy came to dominate the American landscape. We're framing our conversation around a recent paper Tom wrote for AIER, breaking down the different eras of U.S. federalism and the problems created by our current arrangement of fiscal federalism. Let's dive in. Welcome back to The Economist Next Door. Today, I'm joined by 2 of my colleagues. Tom Savidge is a research fellow on the Economic Freedom Team. You heard him in the episode earlier this year. And my colleague, Dave Hebert, who's a senior research fellow on my team, Defending Freedom, Combating Collectivism. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic a lot of people probably don't think about who don't spend their time doing policy, which is the way in which the federal government actually transfers lots of money to state governments for various kinds of spending programs. This has been the case for, a little over a half century, maybe 3/4 of a century now, but that wasn't always the case. Tom is recently released an explainer talking about sort of the history and the relationship between the federal government spending and state government spending. And it used to look very different in early American history. And so in the explainer, which we're going to kind of unpack and talk about the implications today, Tom describes or talks about sort of 4 eras of human history, or not human history, of U.S. history, where the federal government and state governments interacted in different ways. So the first era, you can think about kind of the founding period up through the Civil War. And in that period, the federal government was very, very small. It wasn't doing very many things. It didn't have very many departments. States were, the major show in town when it came to local governance, local spending. And so the federal government was a relatively small player or spender in the economy throughout the first almost 100 years of U.S. history. After the Civil War, things began to change. The country was much bigger. The federal government began to engage in more projects, infrastructure projects, certain limited welfare projects. It began having more control over what states do for a variety of reasons. And then in the early 20th century, between the Civil War and World War II, you have the rise of what's called the progressive era, which was this significant shift in political philosophy where people thought the federal government should do more because we can get experts in there. They can fix problems. It's this national government that concentrates power and wealth, and we can get a lot done. And so the progressive era really unlocks or unchains the federal government in terms of its spending. And then we see that culminate in this third period of U.S. history, which is the New Deal. So you have the Great Depression happens in the 1930s. President Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, is in office for a long time, almost 16 years. And he ushers in what he calls the New Deal, massive programs. We're going to talk about that. And then the final period or era of U.S. history that we're going to talk about is kind of an extension of the New Deal, which is something called the Great Society, which was brought in by President Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. And it was sort of this building on and extending of the New Deal. And at the end of the day, what we'll talk about is post Great Society. We live in a world where the federal government is the gorilla when it comes to governance. They have much bigger budgets. They have much bigger deficits and debts. Lots of state spending money actually comes from the Fed. So anyway, thank you for joining us. We're going to unpack this, and we're going to just jump into talking about each of these eras and then sort of where this leaves us, this relationship between national government spending and state government spending. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much, Paul.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks. So, Tom, why don't you go ahead and maybe just share broadly sort of why you wanted to write this piece in general, and then maybe jump into that early pre-Civil War era.
Well, yeah, sure. So I would say the summary of this, of the main theme of federal transfers to states and state and local governments as well, as just the saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune. In that when the federal government is transferring money to the states, when they're transferring money to local governments, or even just the states sending money to local governments, that funding often comes with terms and conditions baked in. And those terms and conditions often dictate a lot of policy that would never fly in Congress, would never hold up in courts. And, quite often the excuses that comes from federal policymakers is that, well, you guys never had to take the money, you voluntarily took it. And by doing that, you're accepting often really stringent terms and conditions. And that could create a huge roadblock for reforms at the state and local level, and even federal reforms as well, as federal spending becomes more and more unsustainable. And you mentioned that early founding period. Now, of course, there is a bit of a lighter touch, but at the American founding, when during the Constitutional Convention, that the deal there is that if the states are going to give up their debt, they're going to get essentially a bailout from the federal government for the debt they incurred during the Revolution. The federal government, in exchange for that, is going to get the tariff revenue and the ability to a monopoly on issuing currency. And so that right there, you're already seeing the terms and conditions baked in. And aside from that, you get the Northwest Ordinance, which is also a relic of the older system, the Articles of Confederation. And that's, the process of admitting new states to the Union. So when the federal government is giving out these land grants, there's generally a lot of discretion given to the people living in that area. Essentially, there are some requirements saying, each territory's blocked off in lots, and it's, certain lot numbers have to be reserved for schools or the post office or things like that. But, sort of generally what we're seeing is, compared to what we're seeing today, of course, is a much, much lighter touch.
Yeah. So, Dave, how would you describe, like, when you think about the pre-Civil War period, thinking about the federal government and the states and their interaction, what sort of stands out to you from that period?
Right. So what really stands out to me and what Tom highlights in this explainer so well is just how remarkably small the federal government was, and how what we really had were, a dozen or 24 or so, different experiments in democracy, each one trying out different things, learning from one another, slowly and in fits and spurts, I'm sure, but still having that experimentation. And what we've seen over the last 100 years or so is really just sort of a streamlining and simplifying. There's a lot less experimentation. There's a lot less, debate about what is the proper role of government, what are the bounds. It's really just become this mission to expand the amount of money that the state legislature gets to spend on whatever it is they want to do, and wherever they're going to get the money from is just sort of a secondary or even a tertiary consideration at best.
So this is a little bit of a tangent. So we'll see what you guys do. I throw you a little bit of a curveball. But one of the things, if you study U.S. history, that is fairly striking, and you see this in the Civil War itself. Robert E. Lee was this famous Virginian who went to fight for the Confederacy. And one of the things he talked about is he said he's a Virginian first and an American second. And so lots of people identified by their states where they lived, even more so than as Americans or part of this national country. And we don't really see that nearly as much today. And I'm curious on there's maybe two things going on here, and I just want your take on it. One is that states have become less important in some ways, right? The federal government has grown, America has grown. There's much more of a national identity, perhaps, than there was 150 years ago. But I wonder how much of this might be related to mobility, right? That most people have sort of moved around, or they do move around a great deal. And so it's harder to feel loyal to one state in this sort of deep identity sense, right? Of course, you might cheer for the local sports team or whatever, but sort of, oh yeah, I'm a Coloradan before I'm an American, or I'm a Floridian before I'm an American. Like, you don't hear anybody talk like that anymore. So any thoughts? Do you think that's related to this sort of shift of power and influence from the federal government? Is it just sort of a mobility thing? What do you think? I know, curveball.
It's an interesting question, Paul. I think to an extent, though, in defense of the states, I think there's still a lot of important stuff happening at the state and local level. But I think a lot of that sort of, uniqueness is, Dave, you mentioned those, though it started as those experiments, those laboratories of democracy, with those terms and conditions that come baked into federal funding, creates a lot of uniformity. And so a lot of the uniqueness gets lost there. And then you combine that, like you said, with the mobility aspect. Of course, it's much easier to travel across the country these days. And, given the kind of flexibility in the labor market, folks kind of move where the jobs are. Folks move, they've moved where it's an affordable place to live. They might not have as much loyalty. And in the same respect, too, given a lot of these controls and the ways, you probably have an easier time counting the ways in which the federal government does not intervene in everyday life than, trying to figure out how often it does intervene, which almost anything under the sun gets touched by the federal government. And because of that, you end up with a lot of uniformity and the death of a lot of that uniqueness that we saw, especially during the founding era and in the early days of the United States. You think of how you'd read older documents, and I always think of the phrase "these United States" versus "the United States" as a singular entity versus these United States, acknowledging that it's this connection between multiple entities and it's not just this single conglomerate. And so even then too, as you're seeing across the 19th century, that consolidation, that centralization.
Well, so that brings us to the Civil War, really. So, Dave, I want to go to you and weigh in on this question. And then the Civil War is really where so many things change, right? Many things for the better, of course, abolishing slavery and so forth. So, but it really does change the dynamics, how we think about the Union, right? I mean, it was the Union versus the Confederacy, which in its own names are sort of different types of associations. And this post-Civil War era, there's definitely a change in national identity in a variety of ways, but that you stop saying these United States. I don't know if it's right after the Civil War, but that period, it's much less of that kind of association or confederacy kind of idea. So, Dave, what do you think in terms of like this shift to the national government kind of running the show, and then the dynamics of the Civil War and post-Civil War?
Right. So I think that's exactly right. Now, if you look at, pre-Civil War documents, just like you two were saying, a lot of them say these United States, implying that there's sort of a voluntary association among these separate entities that we call states who would come together to solve, major collective action problems, right? But everything else was specifically granted to the states as the problem that they were going to solve, and they would go out and solve it kind of in their own way. But after the Civil War, that transition to the United States really kind of took root. And it's at some level fortuitous timing on our part that we're recording this during the Winter Olympics, when the whole national identity is really being thrown like right in our faces all the time. Now, look, on the world stage, when it comes to athletic contests, I have no problem calling myself an American instead of a Michigander. I don't know how many Michigan folks we have in the Olympics right now, but I suspect it's not very many. Despite
I don't know. It's the Winter Olympics, though, right?
It is the winter, so we do have that going for us, right?
Yep.
So it could be some. I don't deny that. But, for the Olympics, I am an American first and a Michigander second. I don't care which American wins bobsledding or whatever. I want an American to win every single one, right? But in other respects, I do view myself more as a Michigander than I do as an American. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't support America. It doesn't mean that I don't want America to thrive. It just means that I care about Michigan because that's where I live. And what's interesting is the rhetoric coming out of Washington, D.C., from both Republicans and Democrats, frankly, is that, we as Americans need to stick together and we need to make sacrifices for the common American good. Right? Look at tariffs. Look at all the national politics that are coming out. all of that is an attempt to say that we as Americans need to spend more on our domestic production so that other people, perhaps outside of, in my case, Michigan, can have better, more gainful employment. That's a sacrifice that we should make for ourselves.
So I'm sympathetic to that, Dave, and I kind of feel somewhat similarly. I wonder what you think about this. This is what I've been wrestling with, which is, okay, so we say that we're in favor of the states, and we Colorado, Michigan. How much of your writing and your thinking is about Michigan problems versus about national problems?
Right. So that's a great point. So almost all of my writing is going to be about national problems.
Mine too.
Yeah, so I do focus on the national problems, but I do so with an eye in my particular case because manufacturing is such an important part of the Michigan economy, and it's such a major component of this administration's, agenda. So when they're setting national policy to promote manufacturing, yes, it's clearly not specifically targeted to Michigan, but a lot of promises have been made to Michigan vis-a-vis manufacturing. And so I'm going to dodge your question cleverly by saying, even though I'm focusing on national politics, it has primary jurisdiction here for things that I'm worried about.
There you go. Good. I like it. Well, so Tom, to kind of play up on this point, do a ton of work on states. It's really great to hear and listen to you talk about Illinois pensions or California pensions or Alabama. So you're very much involved in the states and have worked in that for a long time. Could you comment a little bit about how federal and national stuff sucks all the oxygen out of the room often, right? Where it's basically like everybody is following what the Department of Transportation or ICE or whatever is doing. And it's very hard in many cases to highlight state issues, in part because, maybe you highlight some detailed thing in Indiana. Like, why does someone in Southern Arizona care, right? Or why does somebody in Washington State care? So maybe you talk about some of the challenges and the dynamics of highlighting issues and policy ways to improve at the state level because, the national stories get so much attention.
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. And it really is it really can be an uphill battle, especially when you're trying to communicate why it's important to somebody outside of that particular state. Of course, it's like the president is doing something that the president, for better or worse, is one of the most powerful people in the world. So, the president says something, everybody listens, the cameras turn in his direction. And so the president is going to, almost always make a huge splash in the news. And so you're fighting the media stream there. But I think too, it gets back to that federal transfer question again, like all those examples you mentioned, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's entitlements, it's federal money going to the states and sometimes passing through the state governments into local governments as well. When you look under the hood, although it's often flies under the radar, the average state gets about a third of its spending from the federal government. Now, why does that happen? Because as Dave mentioned, as you mentioned it, we're losing this uniqueness there in the states. We lose the ability for states to really be those laboratories of democracy. And I think it's really important to look at incentives. Well, not only are you getting that, that element of control for the federal level, that, the terms and conditions that come in, there's incentives at the state level as well, where you can increase spending. As Dave, as you mentioned earlier, they can increase spending and it's going to be paid for by federal taxpayers in the 49 other states. And so you're able to increase spending. And then also, at the state level, these state officials can go back and say, look, we kept all of these programs funded and we didn't raise your state taxes. And then, of course, as the federal government is starting to see more and more strain on the budget, which, we're seeing, the CBO just came out with a report and it's more doom and gloom, right? More debt. The Social Security is going to be unable to pay full benefits by the time the 100th anniversary comes around of Social Security. And that strain creates a lot of pressure on federal policymakers. But at least from what I see, before they dare touch programs that are going to affect their electability, they're going to adjust funding to the states because, that's a really interesting scenario where, you take Medicaid, for example. It's not just federal money handed over to the states. It's a matching program where if the state spends X amount of dollars, the federal government will match it depending on what type of Medicaid there is. And, all it takes is a couple tweaks and say, oh, we're moving, we're matching, maybe a percentage point lower, but that translates into billions of dollars. And then, when the states are on the hook for that, the federal government can say, well, the bad decisions that happened to the state have nothing to do with us. They throw their hands up and say, all we said was the states had to pitch in a little more. We didn't tell them they had to make cuts or raise taxes or take on debt. They're able to wash their hands of the situation, right?
Classic political move, blame shifting.
Yep.
So, Tom, just to follow up on this, I wonder if you could comment on, it's interesting where we think about states getting their money from the federal government, which sounds a lot like they're coming hat in hand to the federal government, which in some cases they are. That's their posture. But it's not like the states are these sort of foreign countries that are receiving foreign aid out of the sort of beneficence of the money the federal government has is coming from people in the states. And so, the federal government is taking money from people in those states and then giving it back to the states with all these strings attached and so forth. But I wonder if you could comment briefly. One thing I've heard other people may have heard about is that some states are more subsidized than other states. So some people argue, oh, well, some of these poorer red states are actually subsidized by California and New York because you have very high taxpayers and big companies in those states. And then others say, well, no, actually the blue states are being subsidized by people in red states because they have big welfare programs and they take advantage of Medicaid. And I haven't spent really much time at all looking into this. How would you describe, is there any good way to measure? Or is it too convoluted to say, do states mostly get back what their own citizens are kind of paying in taxes to the federal government? Is there a lot of kind of transfers that we can see where some states clearly are beneficiaries and get more than their fair share? Or is it just kind of a muddle and do politicians want it that way so you can't really hold them accountable for what's actually going on?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, Paul. And that map has come up as a lot. And, I have a couple bones to pick where, they say something like California and New York are quote unquote net payers, but it's
Right.
not really the states that are paying because the states aren't paying the federal government. It's taxpayers, it's households, it's businesses. So when you look at those states and we'll say, okay, New York is a net payer state, you have to zoom in a little further. And all of a sudden you realize it's not every county in New York. Some counties in New York are net payers and some are net recipients. Well, why is that? Zoom in a little further. It's zip codes. Zoom in a little further. It's specific households. Some households are net payers, some households are net recipients. And it's funny because, folks who are often advocates of that position, like, oh, these, the blue states are actually net payers, they end up arguing the fact that the rich are paying the wealthiest households, the households that are earning the highest incomes are paying, in often cases more than their fair share of the tax burden.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a great point. Well, and Dave, you worked on the Hill for a while. I wonder if these kinds of conversations came up of whose money are we spending and what do the states think, or what's your take on sort of how this money is being shuffled around, going through the federal government, coming back to the states?
Yeah, so I previously worked for the Senate Budget Committee, and I can tell you right now the answer to your question is no. No one has asked the question of where is this money coming from? Whose money are we actually spending? Right? No one has ever concerned themselves, at least
It's
in
just the
Hill.
money.
It's just money, right? It's just green. It's got some pictures of some dead people on it, and we're going to spend it, right? And that is unfortunately the thing, because realistically, Paul, you're exactly right. That is what every policymaker should be concerned with: is whose money am I spending and on what? And is that money actually in the national interest? Right. This was the Davy Crockett story from way back in the day when Georgetown, the community was on fire, and Congress rushed to pass some spending package that would help put out the fire and help these people get back on their, feet and everything, which, as a charitable enterprise, I don't see any issue with a charity doing that. But the question becomes, is Congress a charity? Right. And this was one of, Davy Crockett's constituents' concern. Said, look, that's not yours to give. It's the title of an essay that's hosted on the Foundation for Economic Education's website. Right. And so that is, to me, the thrust of the question. Right. Whose money are we spending and on what? And no one in Congress is asking that question.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you bring up that example because maybe I've kind of taken us off course, but maybe we can go back to the thread we were drawing because we were talking kind of pre-Civil War, post-Civil War. And you remind me of a story. So post Civil War, you have generally growing government involvement in the economy, especially in railroads and in antitrust, regulating just a much bigger entity. You get in the early 1900s the income tax, direct election of senators, the Federal Reserve, some fairly major extensions of government power. But one contrast to that was actually President Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, who ran as a Democrat or was a Democrat at the time, and he was very much trying to rein the government in. And I can't remember all the details of the story, but I think there was some kind of significant famine or a drought in Texas. And so farmers in Texas were really hard up, had lots of problems. And there were bills. Congress, I think, actually passed a bill to provide relief funding for the farmers in Texas. And Cleveland, I believe, vetoed it for exactly the same reasons, where he says, look, the federal government's job is not to just take care of people in random states for wherever, like, that's not what the federal government is for. That's what state governments are for, what charity is for. And so he vetoed this charity bill, which today would be like, the media would never stop talking about it, of like, oh, you hate people in Louisiana because you won't do any FEMA or money for, the Hurricane Katrina or whatever. So anyway, so that's an example. So besides people like Grover Cleveland, though, you have this trend towards federal government growing, extending. Let's maybe talk about the New Deal, because that's a very significant ramping up of the federal government in a lot of different ways. So again, Tom, I'll go back to you here. Maybe can you kind of set the stage for what was the New Deal about? Why was FDR pushing it? And what were some of the, just a couple, we can talk about we can just spend the whole time talking about that, but a couple of the biggest changes you think that we saw coming out of the New Deal?
Oh, yeah, that's so, as you mentioned, it's that explosion. But of course, the seeds are sown during the progressive era previously, where, they see problems in society as something that could be solved with a technical solution. Oh, we just need the right policy here or that, as everything is sort of as if the economy were a car or a washing machine, that it's like, oh, I just need to tighten this or loosen this and screw this in. And it's that the fatal conceit, as Hayek put it. But yeah, it's, as far as President Cleveland goes, he was kind of one of the last holdouts against greater intervention. But a lot of the intervention that we saw during the Civil War and then beginning in the progressive era really proved, and the ideological changes as well, because with that progressive era came that shift from generally limited government mindset, especially among the upper class in America, as Robert Higgs mentions in his book, Crisis in Leviathan, to this eagerness for interventionism. And that really proves to be the thin edge of the wedge, which then, enables the New Deal to come in, where, they want to respond to the persistent depression that happened, as a result of the crash of 29. They want, FDR comes in. It's funny. I think he ran it initially on limited government principles and then totally did a 180 once he got into office. And it was tons of federal programs, the public works administrations, but it also gives the federal government, you already start to see greater federal control exerted over the states. And the clear example of this is actually the state of Arkansas. If you humor me here with this, I have a little story on this, where the state of Arkansas, knowing that the automobile industry was starting to boom, they said to themselves, we'll take on some debt on some revenue bond debt. We'll take on debt. We'll build these highways, but with the highways will come business, and the debt will pay for itself. We don't have the money to pay for it now, but all the business it's going to bring in, we'll be rolling in the dough. And then, of course, the Great Depression happens. So the money doesn't come in. And all of a sudden, they're unable to pay these debts. And so bond investors, particularly in New York City, are very upset because Arkansas is unable to pay their debt. The governor of Arkansas attempts to declare sovereign immunity and say, listen, we're not paying the debt. We're declaring sovereign immunity. We're not going to pay you guys. So the bond investors go to their friends in Washington and they say, you guys have to make this right. And what is Washington able to do? They threaten the state of Arkansas and they say, we will withhold the Public Works Administration, which is this new federal spending program created under FDR. They said, we're withholding this money until you guys come to the negotiating table and reach an agreement with the bond investors. So that's clear. The federal government putting their thumbs on the scale. And as a result of that, Arkansas comes to the table. The federal government gives them their funds, and the bond investors that, especially the ones that had complained the loudest to the folks in Washington, were made practically whole. And so that right there, even, right out of the gate, basically, you see the federal government using this funding to exert its influence over state and local affairs.
Well, and not just that, but be used by other groups to then exert influence that they want in the states. Yeah, that's a great example. Dave, can you talk a little bit about maybe the economics behind the Great Depression, in terms of why the New Deal was sold as dealing with the Depression? And we don't have to go into like a full-blown thing here, but obviously about this. And so maybe help listeners think through, okay, why were people more accepting of government spending programs and new agencies, and what was that trying to do, and what did it actually do?
Right. So a lot of this comes down to, how people understood the way society kind of operates, and this idea behind the difference between competition and cooperation, right? And so in the pre-Great Depression era, people understood, economic competition to be all about, hey, how can I better serve people and sort of win in that marketplace, right? And if I can build this better mousetrap, if I can make things better and sell things better than someone else down the street, right, then I'm going to be the winner. Now, it's true. We shouldn't ignore this, and Joel Melchior points this out as well, that, when there is competition, there are going to be people who are harmed. Right? They're going to lose their standing. They're going to lose their position in society. But the point of it would be to say that, one, society marches on. It gets better for the overwhelming majority of people. And that sort of rising tide does, in fact, lift all boats, if not, proportionally, at least it's lifting everyone at least somewhat, right? What we saw happen in the Great Depression was basically everything come off the rails, and people were clamoring to kind of understand why. And an easy thing to point to is that there was this lack of coordination. It was the overzealous pursuit of competition that just destroyed everything. Now, we're going to set aside the cheap and easy credit, everything going on in the 20s and why it was called the Roaring 20s that, maybe gave rise to the boom in the bust cycle there. We'll set that aside because everyone thought that was just the way the world should be. And then all of a sudden it wasn't. Well, what if there was some coordinator who could solve these problems, who could get people to sit down together and work out their differences so that everybody wins at least a little bit, instead of having, one person win tremendously and everyone else losing out, right? And that was sort of the idea behind this transition out of the Great Depression, was that we can coordinate our way out. No more competition. We don't have to try to, be better than everyone else. We just need to work together. And the unfortunate reality is that just doesn't work. The real cool thing, as we all, understand from our training and our experiences, is that competition is actually a coordinating method. Right? It's a mechanism to coordinate all of society. And so, yes, we are competing, but we're competing to coordinate better, not to just, outcompete someone. I don't get jealous, Paul, when you write an article that goes into a place that's bigger than anywhere I've been, right? And I assume you don't feel the same jealousy. I want you to do well. You want me to do well. And that's not just because Sam is our boss. It's because we genuinely want the good for each other. And that's true of people writ large. That's what competition brings to the table. But forcing coordination through federal policy, that's just going to be a fool's errand.
So I'm just going to remind our readers here that you were talking about the Great Depression and not 2024.
Correct.
Because so much of what you said is actually totally what the administration's talking about right now. Trade has led to deindustrialization, hollowing out. All of this sort of competitive market has not been good for huge swaths of workers. And we are going to coordinate the American economy. We are going to make sure we build semiconductors. We're going to make sure we, do this kind of energy projects in Venezuela or anywhere else. We're going to make sure that we have these rare earth mineral companies, and we're going to take stakes in American companies. It's remarkable in a lot of ways. And we don't necessarily need to spend too much time here because we want to still kind of hit our story arc. But I was just struck by what you were saying. I'm like, wow, that sounds like our current day and age, right? We can't trust the market. We got to coordinate. We've got to have national policy. We've got to have strategy. because otherwise China's going to eat our lunch and we're going to have all these problems. But what's amazing is we haven't even had a Great Depression. I mean, we did have COVID, which was really bad, and we had, the economy was not great, but it's not like Great Depression levels bad. It's more, other things going on. But it's remarkable that what you're describing for the Great Depression, I think, is very relevant to our current moment.
I think too, Paul, if I might jump in here, I think quite often the people that use the Great Depression as an example, as if it was this like unprecedented event, and people lived these naive lives prior to that, and there was no need for it. But that's also not the case either. Of course, America experienced more than its fair share of economic downturns. Even earlier in the history of the country, another example is the canal bubble, where like I mentioned with Arkansas with the highways, states said, well, we'll build these canals, the businesses will come in, and the debt will pay for itself. And again, that happened. But they go to many states, particularly Ohio, Indiana, they go to Congress and they say, hey, can you bail us out? And Congress said, we absorbed the debt from the revolution because it was an existential crisis. We were fighting for our existence. You guys just made some really dumb investment choices this time around. We are not bailing you out. And that caused a lot of damage. Credit ratings in the United States plummeted. But out of that crisis came many of the first balanced budget amendments, which of course they're no silver bullet. They're not total protection against unreasonable and reckless spending. But it gets people, the crisis could be an opportunity for people to say, hey, wait a second, we need to drastically change course here. And that, that sort of correction mechanism, sometimes it's the carrot, sometimes it's the stick, allowed for a lot of excellent and, unprecedented growth prior to the Great Depression too.
Yeah, never let a good crisis go to waste. That's kind of a good crisis where there's sort of or a good outcome of the crisis in your case. But it's a little different than, I mentioned Robert Higgs earlier and Christ and Leviathan. He talks about this kind of ratchet effect where there's emergencies or expansions of government, and then it gets scaled back some, but not completely, and then it kind of continues to grow. And so we should talk about that more, especially Great Society. But before we do, one thing I think that is worth thinking about is interesting. You mentioned how the U.S. had fairly severe recessions and even depressions before the Great Depression, and the country got through it, right? The country made it. I think today, in our sort of hyperbole society, in the media, you suggest ending Social Security and people are like, grandma's going to die, right? So Dave, maybe going to you, maybe help people understand that they can live without these massive government programs, or what would happen if we had something really radical? Tom's talking about, we have sovereign debt crisis, interest rates spike. The federal government really has to scale back its spending. You get some reformer in there who is actually serious about reforming the major programs. Are people going to die when we do that? Or like, what is this possible? And how did people survive pre-Medicare?
Right. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there, right? Is to point out that before any of these, programs that we might have in place today existed, people lived, right? They didn't just die. It's not like people turn 62 years old and just like, boop, we're done. Right? There was some way by which they lived, before Social Security existed. Now, I will say, and I think it's a fair statement, that if we just, flipped a magic wand or flipped a switch today and just ended Social Security, that would cause tremendous, problems. Okay. There are, millions of people that have been budgeting for and planning on those benefits for a very long time. So it has set itself up to be a major problem if we just, turned it off today. But here's kind of the thing. We do have sort of a mini experiment of ending a program in recent times. So recall that just a few months ago, we had a SNAP benefit, snafu, where the funding ran out and people were not getting their SNAP benefits. Right now, I didn't look at morgue data or anything like that, but I didn't see a spike in people dying, because of the lack of food, as we were warned that they would do. Right? We were warned that millions of people who are, living in food deserts and in vulnerable situations would lose access to food. And as a result, they would starve to death, right? If these funding packages were not passed. And lo and behold, what happened was exactly what we would predict has happened as a charitable a charitable society. People stepped up and actually gave a lot more food to food pantries. They organized private ones. Basically, people stepped up and solved the problem, right? I was driving through Ann Arbor, and all I saw up and down the roads that time were basically signs outside saying, hey, if you're hungry, come over here. And there was just a giant pile of canned food, of, things that people could come pick up and just take with them. No questions asked, right? And that's, admittedly a very progressive city, but we saw this in conservative cities as well. So this was a nationwide phenomenon. And here's, I guess, my point here is that the American people are incredibly generous. You just have to let them show that generosity. Right now, what we have is sort of this idea behind, hey, Jesus, if we give the Romans our money and let them spend it, right? Isn't that good? And Jesus says, well, no, let me tell you again, right? Take care of the poor and help them out, right? And that's the idea, is like, that's our society in a nutshell, is we will step up and help people. I believe in the American people's charitableness. Unfortunately, people in Washington don't.
No, that's right. And they think they're being charitable.
Right.
Yeah.
I would say that's a great point, Dave. And I would love to, to show a foil to that too, where increased intervention ends up hurting people, where you look at Medicaid, for example. So for those who don't know, traditional Medicaid is based on, that matching rate is based on the federal medical assistance percentage, which is anywhere between 50 and 70% matching rate. And now Medicaid was also expanded under the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. But to get states to enroll in that expansion group, the federal government promised a 100% matching rate, which has now been pared down to 90%. But still, that's far and away more money than traditional Medicaid is getting. But whether or not somebody falls into the traditional Medicaid group versus the expansion depends on their income. Lower income people get pooled into traditional Medicaid, while the quote unquote higher income people end up in the expansion group. But because that expansion is getting more generous federal programs, the people in traditional Medicaid are often left behind. And you hear these heartbreaking stories of people who died because they couldn't access treatment because the states, given the incentives, are prioritizing the program that's giving them the maximum amount of federal money coming in. And so to counter that, it's opposite what, many claim that, the private, here we're seeing in Dave's example, the private sector is stepping up to help people. And meanwhile, the interventions, the government programs end up hurting the poorest Americans.
So, Tom, I have some questions about that. So are you saying that states have two Medicaid programs? They have like their traditional Medicaid program, then they have like a Medicaid expansion or Medicaid Plus that's like a separate program that people get into and has different levels of treatment or care?
Yes. Yeah. And it depends on income level, because these programs were created at different time periods. So you have traditional Medicaid.
But they're separate programs.
Sort of, it would all be under the same state agency, same federal agency, but how these programs get administered depends on, the type of program, when it was enacted. And so in between, you had traditional Medicaid, which came in the late 60s under what President Johnson called the Great Society program. In the 90s, you had the Children's Health Insurance Program created, which was created to provide children health insurance coverage if they lived in a household where their parents made above the income threshold to qualify for Medicaid. And then now, and under, in 2009, under the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, you had this new Medicaid group created. And so that, while it's all under, say in a state agency, it's under the Department of Health and Human Services. These are different programs because they're getting different levels of funding. They're getting different matching rates. And initially,
So to build on that for people who aren't in the weeds on this, because it's confusing and it's really messed up in a lot of ways. So the way this works, like what Tom's referring to with the matching, is you're a state health agency and you sign someone up for Medicaid, and let's say you end up spending $10,000 on their care, like providing them care over the course of a year, $10,000. What Tom is saying is traditional Medicaid, when it was set up, the federal government would match 50 or 60% of that. So the state spends $10,000 on this person, they get $5,000 or $6,000 from the federal government reimbursing them, basically. So the state, out of the state budget or the state taxes, are only paying $5,000 or $6,000, even though they've actually spent $10,000 because the feds are backfilling at this 50 or 60% rate. And then what Obamacare did is it created this incentive to expand. And they said to the states, if you add new people, and I don't know the qualifications or the criteria for these new people, but for every new person you add to Medicaid, you spend $10,000 on their health insurance, we'll give you $9,000. And so from the state legislature and state government standpoint, this is a great deal because you can offer this free service, $10,000 of medical care, to more people, but it only costs you, the state government, $1,000, and it costs the federal government $9,000. And so you have this really messed up incentive where states are paying a highly subsidized cost to enroll new people into Medicaid, and the federal government is paying for it. And this was part of the big, beautiful bill last year in the reforming Medicaid. People were upset about it, but what they were trying to reform is this sort of explosion that happened in enrolling people in Medicaid, both because of Obamacare and some COVID stuff. And it was the line item for the federal spending was just exploding, getting huge. So am I right on that, Tom? You want to add any nuance there, or Dave?
Yeah, that's right. And too, it's among federal transfers, Medicaid is the single largest. And, even in state budgets, Medicaid often is one of the single largest, if not the largest line item for state spending. And, we could spend hours just talking about the different kinds of accounting gimmicks that states get involved in to maximize those federal payments. And maybe a discussion for another day, but the provider tax loophole, which was just recently closed, by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. But that was a loophole that states were using to tax healthcare providers, increase and have that tax count as spending. So that way the federal payments would increase coming in, and they'd give some kickbacks to the providers that were initially taxed in the first place. And it's created a lot of these distorted incentives. It's really decreased access to care. And when you combine this huge subsidized industry with an industry that's also heavily regulated at the federal and state level, it's really hurt access to healthcare. And it's an industry that, quite frankly, deals with life and death. And you don't want an industry that deals with saving people's lives. You don't want it to be inaccessible. You want to make it as accessible as possible. You want to encourage innovation. You want to encourage driving down costs. And that all is, to bring it back, it all comes back to competition.
Famous economist Farag Bashiat called taxes legalized plunder. What you're describing, Tom, is legalized money laundering. It's unbelievable. We could really go into this, but it's totally money laundering by California and these other states. So as we wrap here, Dave, I'm going to give you the last word. So go whatever you want with it. But as we're walking away from this conversation, thinking for listeners, what sorts of things should we keep in mind about the federal transfers to the states and the role of federal spending versus state spending? How would you kind of put a bow on this in terms of what should we kind of walk away with in terms of emphasis?
So what I would look at is, how dependent is the state on federal funding? And the answer that Tom's explainer beautifully shows is that they are all very dependent. That exposes those states to tremendous risk. Now, to get over that hurdle means divorcing yourself from the federal government. But that is a painful process. It's a politically costly process. And so you need to be cognizant of what's going on and what sort of exposure you actually have to a potentially capricious administration.
That's a great note. Yeah, that's so very practical conclusion there for states to be thinking about. Well, Dave, Tom, thank you for joining me and for being part of this podcast for The Economist Next Door.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, guys.